speak Turkish, but I heard my name, so and Zurich Lab, so it was probably about us. So what I will speak about in the next 25 minutes or so is about technologies that will change the world. As you know, IBM as a computer company, I mean, we've been around for a long time, now 101 years, this whole industry is still going extremely strong, and it's changing more, and has been changing more in the last 10 years than it had changed in the prior 30 years. And that's what will continue, I think, as we go forward. Briefly, where I come from, you already heard about IBM Research. We are a global organization. The world is our lab. That's our motto these days. We have labs that across the entire globe. Now we opened just this year in July a new lab in Kenya. So we're present on all continents other than Antarctica. IBM Research itself is the world's largest information technology research organization. It's 3,000 people that, scientists and engineers that work in these labs across the world. IBM spends $6.3 billion on research and development, so it's not all on the research part. And we're proud that we have had 5 Nobel laureates, 4 of which worked at the Zurich lab, work for us in IBM Research. I will now get into really the core of my presentation, and the one thing that I hope you will take away from it is that in our industry we've made the progress both through continual improvement of existing things as well as through very disruptive innovations. Disruptive innovations means doing away with old things, coming up with entirely new ideas, not continuously improving, but really changing the game. When you look at, and this is what I will cover in my presentation, the 4 technology areas that I believe will have a profound impact still going forward in the next 5-10 years. It's from the bottom up. It's basically from the chip technology to systems, to the data that gets processed with these systems, to how we actually program these systems going forward. So I will cover those 4 areas. And what you can see here on those on the screen is you see always this 1000x, and here you see even a larger number. And that's what's so exciting, that Moore's law that has been around for the last almost 50 years still continues in some ways to be true as we go forward. Moore's law stated that you double the number of transistors in 18 months or so. Sometimes it was in shorter amounts of time, sometimes it took a little longer. But on average, 18 months. And that means essentially, when you do the math or so, that in the course of 10, 12 years, you really see an improvement of a factor of 1,000. And that's what we saw in the past 50 years since the law really was invented. And that's what we will see going forward in the next 10 years. Not anymore that we will necessarily double the number of transistors every 18 months, but we will improve in other ways the performance that we get these types of results. Let me get into sort of the first part, the area of the chips. When you look at current processors, and they are already what we call nano devices, you have a billion transistors on a Power 7 chip, which is IBM's Unix system that's built from these Power 7 chips. What you will see in the future is so-called nanosystems, which means essentially you have entire systems on a chip. You will have, and I will have an example later on, how you will integrate many of peripheral functions that you have onto the same piece of silicon or onto stacked pieces of silicon, and you will end up with 1 trillion devices, so a factor of 1,000 more than what we currently have, all in the course of the next 10 years. The fact that I'm not just speculating here and I'm telling you something that is not founded in reality, I have this chart here that's currently going into production, conventional planar devices, 22, 20 nanometers, meaning essentially that's what you find in high-end processors. The transistors are still made in sort of a layered structure. What you will see as we go to 15 and 11 nanometer nodes, which is smaller, you will see three-dimensional structures, so-called FinFETs, and you will see new materials being used. And then silicon nanowires as we go forward to 8 nanometers and beyond. And what I'm showing you here are either pictures of actual devices that we've built, or here when it comes to carbon electronics, which is using, for example, carbon nanotubes as switches, measurements that we've done on individual carbon nanotubes to demonstrate the effectiveness of making switches from these devices. So you can see this is not just speculation, this is in fact already in our labs being worked on. And what you can see is it's disruptive technology at each node. Here, as I said, new structures, three-dimensional. Here it's also new materials. Here you see it's essentially changing the entire geometry, moving to these to wires instead of planar things. And then certainly when you move into carbon electronics, it's again a very disruptive change. So the thing that I mentioned earlier, the 1 trillion devices on a chip will be achieved in some ways by stacking layers of chips and having then interconnects between these layers, using in fact on the chip to some extent optical communication in and out just to deal with increased bandwidth to feed the chip with data. And really integrating many different technologies into the same package. That's the vision that we have in how we will get to the 1 trillion devices. If we look at systems, now systems meaning essentially what do you build from these chips, what we currently have is so-called, we talk about workload optimized systems. When we talk about high performance computing, we talk about petaflop systems. We just, this year in Munich in July, inaugurated Europe's fastest supercomputer, a 3 petaflop machine that is built from somewhat modified commercial hardware. It's a large cluster. In the future, what we're talking about is exascale. So exascale is, again, an order of magnitude more than petascale computing. And why are we doing this? Because, first of all, these supercomputers are used already for a lot of things like material science, simulations of certainly a big driver is simulation of nuclear research in the United States, but it's also, as I said earlier, material science. It is modeling of weather and other things where you never have enough computing power to really give a full picture. And what happens with these, it's like Formula One racing with these supercomputers. The technologies that get prototyped here over time then percolate down into our commercial systems that we sell to normal clients that are not in the supercomputing business. And they benefit, in fact, then also from these performance increases as we go forward. And BlueGeneQ is the computer that's actually coming out, or has come out this year. That's already in the 20 petaflop range. And then we have ideas, as I said earlier, how we get to exascale computing. What does this require? It in fact requires, when you really move to these high performance computing systems, it requires you to really look at the entire system. So from the processor to the what is called the multi-chip module, this is the carrier, that's where you combine multiple chips, into the way that the system is built up, the drawers where the various printed circuit boards are, the rack of the system, then the machine room, and the entire data center. All these things need to be in some way built together and follow one architecture. An example, and I mentioned this supercomputer that was inaugurated in Munich this year, is comes out of our research in the Zurich lab, is this Aquasar cooling system. It's so-called hot water cooling that you apply to the chips, all the chips on a system, that reduces the energy consumption of such a computer by 40%. Why is it 40%? Basically, when you run a data center, half of the energy is spent on running the computers, and the other half of the energy is spent on removing the heat that the computers generate. So air conditioning and cooling systems. With hot water cooled computers, you can in fact get rid of the air conditioning, and what you do get out of the computer is you get high-grade heat. We can cool the computer with 60-degree warm water. We get 70-degree warm water out of the computer, and that can be then used for district heating swimming pools if you want. It can be used also for cooling with a process called adsorption chilling, where you use a chemical process that requires the heat to cool, and you can do air conditioning then in the summer, using that energy that you've actually the heat that you've generated by powering the chips. Now, clearly when you have a hot water cooled system, and this is SuperMUC, that's this computer I spoke about earlier that's based on this technology developed in Zurich, you really need to build an entire data center to make use of this. And so that's what I was saying earlier. So it's a 3 petaflop system, and here the hot water is used to cool the processor, and it just does cut down on the electricity use. And then the data center, the way it's built up, has appropriate pipes and has appropriate feeds then into the district heating, so it actually makes use of this excess heat. So what we will see is, and already here you just see the space it takes up. 1 petaflop was 72 BlueGeneP racks, 10 petaflop, which is 100 P7 IH racks. This is possible, but what you will see is, in fact, new technologies flow in here in terms of improvements on the CPU. The way we will in the future probably no longer have spinning disks in these systems. We will use solid-state memories, so-called phase change memories. We will use optoelectronics in the systems, and we will 3D integrate things inside the computer. An example of this 3D integration is something we're working on as a research project currently, by putting multiple layers of silicon on top of one another. Each layer of silicon one layer could be a processor, the next layer would be memory, a third layer could be I/O, then you could start again with processor, memory, I/O. You can build layers of these silicon chips on top of one another, and you connect them vertically. The advantage of connecting them vertically is that you have much shorter distances to bridge, and the longer the distance is, the more energy gets used. And the only challenge that remains then is you need to still cool the various layers of silicon, and that we do with basically running the coolant through the various layers of silicon and making sure that we have these fine channels here so we can build a 3D stack that can be effectively cooled. This is very much inspired by the way the human brain works. The human brain is also not something flat, but it's a three-dimensional structure, and things get connected much more direct that way in the brain, as we will do with these 3D stacks. One additional twist to this work in the future will be to also feed energy into this 3D stack, not via these pins here, which is already currently with current computer technology a limitation that you don't have enough pins that you can really feed enough energy into the chip. When you start stacking them, it will really become a limitation. So the idea is to use, in fact, the coolant to also chemically carry the energy, and then, like in a battery, generate electricity within the chip. And that's what we then call 5D integration. So 3D meaning the 3 dimensions, the 4th dimension being the cooling, and the 5th dimension being powering the chip chemically, and then just changing it into electricity inside the chip. Would use need a nuclear power plant to run it. And so that's not a viable approach. When you think the human brain works with about 20 watts, you don't want gigawatts of power to run an exaflop computer. And so that's another area of research, how to really cut down on the electricity consumption. And this 3D integration certainly is one way of doing so in the future. The other thing that now I've covered basically the chip technology, I've covered systems. What do these computers do? What do they work on? It's basically processing data. And what we see, in fact, with the data, we see an increase of the amount of data that will need to be processed from anywhere a factor of 1,000 to 1,000,000. Why is that? Because when you look at the way our environment is being fitted with sensors, how we have video cameras throughout, that webcams, how we have sensors that monitor electricity use, smart meters, etc., cell phones. We have so many devices, as and some people claim it's 50 billion devices, so this will be, when you look at the population of the Earth, it will be for every human will have quite a few devices that they have. In fact, I think this is probably a conservative number, but it means essentially that in the future we will generate a lot more than these 15 petabytes of data, and already now companies spend a lot of money in just finding information that they have and dealing with it. And what we will see in the future is that a lot of the data that gets generated is in fact unstructured data, and largely really email, images, and video information. And that is going to be a key requirement then in the future to deal with this data and be able to store it and process it. Process it not only in sort of an offline mode, but also in real time. One of the projects that my lab in Zurich is now involved in with the Dutch, in the Netherlands, the Institute for Astronomy is called, the project is called DOME. And in the DOME project, we want to develop over the next 5 years the technology to build something that's called the Square Kilometer Array, which is a radio telescope slated to be going online in 2024, so it's still 12 years out. That is, if you put all the radio telescopes together, would cover an area on Earth of a square kilometer. But they're not going to be put up in the square kilometer, they're going to be put up across South Africa and also in Australia and New Zealand. Radio telescopes that will research basically the Big Bang and that will listen into space. They will generate data in the raw that is 10 times the current internet traffic. And in order to process it, you will have a computer system that has the processing power of more than 100 million PCs. This is exaflop computing. And so the technologies and the roadmap that we're working on with Astron, this Astronomy Institute in the Netherlands, is really to look at green supercomputing. So these 3D chip stacks that I mentioned earlier, building out high-performance storage systems. But what is clear, you cannot store all the data that gets generated for later processing. So you will have to do a lot of the processing in real time as the data gets generated, and you can store then the digested data in a cloud-like environment. Nanophotonics and optical interconnect technologies will be a key requirement to collect the data and store it and keep the various systems synchronized with one another. And as the memory technology is concerned, we will work on phase change memories, phase change materials, and for lack of an alternative, still tape technologies, because tape is still the only archival and long-term backup media that exists. A lot of hopes had been placed in the past in optical storage media, holographic storage media, but none of these have actually gotten to the point where they can be used. Now I'll move up to the top level. How will we in the future program these systems and what will happen? And as the chart already says here, we will move from what we currently have, computers that are still programmed and that learn somewhat, to in the future systems that will in fact be learning systems that will no longer be programmed. A system that is programmed still was our Watson computer that, and this is what the small image here is showing, that played this Jeopardy game last year and won in the US. It's sort of like Trivial Pursuit. But it was able to answer questions and beat the two human champions at this game in a televised performance. What is Watson? Watson is built really, as I said, it's still programmed. It's built on standard Power 7, Linux, and then middleware. But it has the statistical rule-based analysis, the statistical learning framework, and that serves, in fact, already to some extent to make the system a learning system. Because what Watson did is when it answered a question wrong, it readjusted the statistics of its evaluation engines, and it became smarter as it went along, and it got trained. And one of the things that we're doing with Watson these days now is in fact to train it not to play Trivial Pursuit or Jeopardy, but to in fact help in medicine. Help in medicine, doctors that have to digest more medical literature that gets published every day than is humanly possible. and help doctors with both diagnosis and then also treatment. And what you can see is as you work with a baseline Watson, this was the Jeopardy system, and what this shows is the precision with which questions were answered. So precision meaning number of questions rightly answered or wrongly answered. It already was pretty good in some sense. I mean, 20% of the questions were answered. If you made it answer all questions, 20% were answered correctly. If you cut down the number of questions to be answered to fewer, where it had more confidence, then already it answered half of the questions quite well. Then in a 3-month effort, we trained Watson to work on medical questions, and you can see already the improvement that we gained from it. And that's a collaboration that we're doing now in the United States with WellPoint, a large healthcare provider, to send, if you want, Watson to medical school to become a doctor's assistant. And this is what it possibly may look like. So the doctor may ask, how do I manage a person with lung cancer who has HER2 mutation? I'm not a medical doctor, so I wouldn't know what an HER2 mutation is, but Watson then would answer with certain treatment plans. And it will give you confidence as to what it thinks is a good answer. And now that, and that's one thing already that was important in the Jeopardy game, because if you answered the question wrong, you lost whatever you had waged. However, what Watson also has is this thing here where it says you can, if you want, you can click on it and you get the evidence that supports this statement, and then the doctor can in fact read that piece of medical literature that would support it, and the doctor can apply his own judgment or her own judgment as to whether this is an appropriate suggestion or not. So the advantage is that Watson will digest medical literature in real time, ingest all of the things that get published, all the results that get published, and will in that sense be a very valuable resource to medical doctors to improve the way they diagnose and the way they treat diseases. Now these learning systems that I spoke about in the future, they will be a lot more inspired, much as I said earlier, bio-inspired 3D stacking, human brain, the way the body works, blood cools, blood supplies energy, will be inspired by, to some extent, by neurological discoveries, the fact that what we call neuromorphic computing, new interconnects and entirely new architectures. So one of the areas where we are doing a lot of research in the United States is on what we call, it's a project called Synapse, which really is to build neurons and synapses in silicon to build really learning systems. And they have a roadmap that would indicate that they can put the number of neurons and synapses on a chip that is equivalent to a human brain in the next 10, 15 years. Not that it is like a human brain, don't get confused, because the human brain isn't even understood yet how it works. But one understands that with such a computer made from synapses and neurons, you can already do a fair bit of image recognition quite well, and you can do a lot of things that with a traditional computer are extremely difficult, and you will do it in a much more energy efficient way. So it's going to be new chips, new interconnects, entirely new architectures. An area that we're also researching somewhat is what people call DNA computing. That's truly a completely disruptive change, using DNA to do computations, and research around new switches. I already mentioned nanowires, and then in the future carbon electronics, and that's what this is here showing. So I'm coming to an end. So what's really happening is we're entering into a new era. IBM started, I guess, earlier with meat grinders and cheese cutters. We then started with a tabulating era. That was computing at the beginning, just counting things. The computing era, first sort of electronic computers, and now we're getting into something which we call the cognitive systems era. That's basically computers that are a lot more inspired by the way the human works, will be a lot more powerful than what we currently have, use a lot less energy than what we currently use, and will be learning instead of being programmed. And that brings me to the end. Thank you very much.